Welcome everyone to the Collaborative Mentoring webinar series, and thank you for joining us. Today we'll be talking about expanding corporate engagement by strengthening infrastructure. I'm Audrey Cruz from Colorado, and I'll be facilitating today's conversation. Let's get started. This webinar is part of the Collaborative Mentoring webinar series, which is funded by the Office of Juvenile Justice and Delinquency Prevention through the National Mentoring Resource Center, and facilitated in partnership with Mentor, the National Mentoring Partnership. These webinars would not be possible without the planning team, which includes the mentoring partnership shown on this slide. In addition to this webinar series, the NMRC provides resources for mentoring practitioners. At the end of this webinar, we'll provide more details about how you can access this free support. Before we get started, I wanted to share some housekeeping information. In 1 week, you'll receive an email with information about how to download a copy of these slides and view the webinar recording. You can also access this information directly by going to Mentor's website in the next week. And to continually improve this series, we're looking for your input. A short survey will pop up as you exit the webinar. Please take just 3 minutes to give us your feedback. We want this to be a participatory experience, so please use the question box to ask questions throughout the webinar. Benji will be queuing up questions to share with panelists during the Q&A portion of the webinar. We may not get to all the questions because there are several hundred of you on the webinar, but we'll do our best. The questions that we share with our panelists are generally ones that broaden or deepen the conversation. So if you have additional questions after our Q&A, we encourage you to email or try to reach out to our panelists directly to learn more about this topic. So first, to get a sense of who is with us today, we'll have 2 short polls. First poll, we want to know what your experience level is in the mentoring field. Are you a beginner? Are you experienced? Or are you an expert? All right. Excellent. It looks like 74% of our attendees are experienced. So the vast majority of people on this call have been working in the mentoring field for a while. So our next question is, what is your role in the mentoring field? So are you a practitioner, a researcher, a technical assistance provider, a funder, or something else? All right. So we have 53% of our attendees are practitioners. Excellent. Thank you so much for the work that you do, and we're so happy to have you on this call. We also have 2% researchers, 8% technical assistance providers, 3% funders, and 34% other. Well, I'm so happy everybody is here. We welcome everyone and think and hope that today's information will be applicable to everyone on the line. So let's look at our objectives. Businesses have so much to offer our programs beyond sponsorship and direct service volunteers. In our webinar today, we will explore ways that corporate partnerships can strengthen organizational infrastructure, learn best practices and tools to truly leverage skills-based corporate volunteers, and we will examine approaches and models for engaging corporate employees on boards and committees that are active and aligned to organizational goals.
Hi everyone, sorry to interrupt. It looks like the poll there won't close, so I'm just going to try to relaunch it and close it to get us back to the slides. Sorry for this interruption. There we go.
There we go. There are the objectives. Excellent. And you can actually advance to the next slide then, Jen. Now let's get to our introductions. So as I said, I'm Audrey Cruz. I've supported over 50 diverse nonprofit schools and companies as a management consultant and trainer. I formerly worked as the training manager with Mentor Colorado, where I led statewide quality mentoring initiatives for over 60 agencies. Prior to moving to Colorado, I worked for 12 years with volunteers, youth, and families in Washington, D.C. in various capacities of nonprofit management and youth development. And I also served as an advisor for the D.C. Mentoring Collaborative from 2010 to 2014. I've trained people from across the country and served on numerous mentoring committees locally and nationally. I've also been a mentor for 6 years. So in today's webinar, we have two fantastic panelists that will be joining us. We have Danielle Hawley, who is the CEO of Common Impact, and Dan Horgan, who's the Senior Director of Corporate Engagement at Mentor. So Danielle Hawley is currently the CEO of Common Impact, an organization that designs programs that directs companies' most strategic philanthropic asset, their people, to the seemingly intractable social challenges they're best positioned to address. Danielle has supported hundreds of businesses and nonprofits navigate the new era in corporate social responsibility and skills-based volunteering, including global powerhouses JP Morgan Chase, Charles Schwab, Marriott International, and Fidelity Investments. She's a contributing writer for Nonprofit Quarterly on strategic corporate engagement. She's a member of Nation Swell Council and has served on the board of directors for the Young Nonprofit Professionals Network and Net Impact New York City. Welcome, Danielle.
Thank you. It's great
to
be here.
Next up, we have, great, thank you. Next up, we have Dan Horgan. As the Senior Director of Corporate Engagement at Mentor, Dan Horgan is responsible for building and managing corporate partnerships that help close the youth mentoring gap in America while meeting business goals. Dan has over 18 years of experience working in the business and nonprofit sectors, having served as Executive Director at Generation On, Vice President of Development at the Heart of America Foundation, Senior Director of Community Affairs at Capital One, Youth Program Officer at the Three Rivers Workforce Investment Board, and Executive Director of Pittsburgh Cares. Dan has extensive experience training, consulting, and coaching in the areas of leadership, management, organizational development, and public-private partnerships. He has worked with Fortune 500 companies, national and local nonprofits, school districts, and governments. Daniel is the author of Tell Me I Can't and I Will, and the producer-host of the Community Voices of Change podcast. He resides in New York City. Thank you, Dan, so much for being here. All right, so thank you both panelists, Daniel and Danielle, for being with us today. I'm very excited to kick off this webinar by talking about skills-based volunteerism. So we're going to do another quick poll to gain a clearer understanding of our participants' experiences with skills-based volunteers. So the question is, how much experience does your organization have with skills-based volunteers? A lot, some, none, or other? And if you're going with other, please use the Q&A panel to specify what the other is. All right, so we have 14% who have been using skills-based volunteers as a critical and ongoing resource. And then it looks like the vast majority are somewhere in the middle. There's some use by their organization or they're just getting started. So this looks like this will be a great topic for all of our participants, whether you're experienced or just getting started. We have lots of tips and tools to share with you. So Danielle, to get us started on this topic of skills-based volunteerism, could you tell us about what your organization does and your experience in the space?
Sure, thank you, and hi everyone. It's great to be here and really nice to see the spread of folks that have experience with skills-based, and particularly those who are using it as an ongoing resource. Really eager to learn from you today too. Common Impact is an organization that was founded now 18 years ago on the philosophy that companies have a lot more to contribute to their community than their dollars, and that actually their people, their employees, are one of their largest untapped philanthropic assets that we've got in communities in the social sector writ large. And so to that end, Common Impact partners with companies to design and launch and sustain skills-based volunteer programs that tap into that core expertise and direct it towards the social issues, the nonprofit organizations that can use that resource as a force for good. Skills-based volunteerism, the basic concept of it is that it's a volunteerism service that connects the talents and skills of individuals to the social sector challenges that they're best positioned to address. So essentially amplifying the impact of every hour that volunteers contribute, because it makes the most of how they can contribute. I often use the classic volunteer initiative, a Habitat for Humanity build, as an example. We need a crew of passionate individuals to build those houses. But if those individuals were plumbers and carpenters and electricians instead of, say, lawyers and financial analysts and other business-trained professionals who are interested in doing something good, if we align that skill set, each house is built faster and stronger than they otherwise would be. And that's the basic concept of skills-based volunteering, is creating that connection. Part of what makes skills-based so powerful is something that Common Impact calls the knitting factor. We're moving beyond transactional projects towards really transformational experiences, bringing together corporate employees, nonprofit leaders with very different but complementary skill sets. And they're leaving these projects not only with deliverables in hand that support their capacity and employees with new skill sets, but with new talents, experiences on both sides that make them stronger civic actors and community actors. So that's Common Impact in a nutshell. And if we go to the next slide, you'll see some of the services that we provide to the nonprofit sector. And these are Common Impact services, but they're also basic checklist of what you need to do as a nonprofit to think about approaching skills-based work. So preparing, thinking about your needs, and we support organizations in doing this across business, marketing, operations, technology, finance, HR, strategic planning, and then scope and define projects that are in alignment with the corporate skill set. Common Impact, we're connecting organizations to that skill set, but this is an important piece of work to do, whether or not you're working with an intermediary or not. We then support, so our pro bono program management services take those scoped projects and support nonprofits and corporate employee teams in executing them, and support the partnership development and the sector translation that's needed, that so often comes up when you have a team of corporate employees and a team of nonprofit sector professionals in the room, often for the first time. And then finally, evaluation and measurement, making sure that the organizations that we work with get what they signed up for, but also understanding longitudinally, is this project making an impact on your ability to meet your mission 6 months out, a year out, and so on. And then sustaining, we have a series of webinars, capacity building, technology tools that we share and use freely with the nonprofit sector, and support also companies in developing those tools and training.
Thank you so much for telling us more about how you connect skills-based volunteers with nonprofits at Common Impact. From your experience, Danielle, how can nonprofits and mentoring programs leverage skills-based corporate volunteers to tackle their toughest challenges?
Sure, it's a big question. Corporate skills-based volunteering can be one of the sector's strongest capacity building levers if it's approached as a strategic resource versus a firefighting resource. It takes engagement of staff and board and clarity on the reciprocal value that's being shared. It takes an investment in co-learning, co-creating with a corporate team or corporate professionals. And nonprofit use of pro bono used to be highly reactionary, and it's now moving from reactionary to intentional, meaning that nonprofits would often turn to pro bono and skills-based volunteerism if they unexpectedly lost funding for an important project or something broke. Now nonprofits are really starting to build corporate skills-based volunteering into their operating plans and their budget. And if you move to the next slide, you'll see a snapshot of why this is so important, and wanted to provide a little more perspective on why that intentional integration into planning is something that's critical for the nonprofit sector, though I suspect with this group, I'm likely preaching to the choir. Nonprofits are held to an inaccurate and unfair standard related to overhead, the critical functions that any business across any sector needs to run: strategic planning, talent development, technical infrastructure. Companies spend an average of 20 to 30% on those functions. Nonprofits are expected to keep it often below 10%, and as a result, there's very minimal funding on these functions. So the average nonprofit spends between 2 and 8%, and it's usually closer to that 2% mark on the basic infrastructure that allows organizations to assess what's working well, to grow and scale their models, to retain the staff that make it all work, just the basic business infrastructure. And while there has been progress on this conversation in philanthropic communities, big foundations like Ford are starting to increase their dollars allocated to those capacity building functions for their grants. The progress is still slow, and this is where SkillsBased can be a real resource in expanding that piece of the pie without needing to change the entire sector dynamic, because we can't wait for that. And the how is if you can get your organization on board. So if you look at the next slide, most nonprofit organizations are sold on the concept. 72% believe that they could increase their ability to realize their mission, their impact, through the use of skills-based volunteers. 90% of nonprofits report needing more volunteer support, but it's really challenging for organizations to take that second step. So from when I think about the poll that we had at the beginning, moving from using it occasionally to using it as an ongoing resource is the biggest leap that nonprofits can take in skills-based. And part of that are the three on the right side of the lever that you see on this slide. The intangible long-term value is hard to quantify, or it can be hard to quantify without a framework. And I'll talk a little bit more about that in a moment. It's deprioritized by board and staff, and then often it's not even deprioritized, it's not thought of as a resource. And then finally, a lack of access to pro bono and skills-based volunteering, particularly corporate skills-based volunteerism. Yep, I've got my staff and board on board. I understand the value to my organization, but where the heck can I find these pro bono professionals to help me get it done?
Thank you for that information, Danielle. I think it's almost shocking, the gap that we have in infrastructure spending. It's pretty incredible. So now that we know a bit more about the landscape, let's talk about buy-in. You mentioned the importance of buy-in, and we all know that we need our stakeholders bought in to make these partnerships work. So how can organizations get all stakeholders on board to make this type of engagement successful for everybody involved?
Sure. So it's really tackling those three challenges that were on that right side of the lever, which are all interwoven. The first, and what often feels the most intimidating, is quantifying the value. And you really can quantify the value. Common Impact has a pro bono calculator that we use that we can share along with these slides if folks are interested in it. But asking yourself the question, what does this translate to in terms of dollars saved? How many hours will you save? And what's the bottom line net value? So thinking about both the investment that you need to make the project successful, the immediate value of the deliverable or the product, but also what does this mean for you long term? What are the opportunity costs that without this deliverable you'd be experiencing as an organization? So really thinking strategically about the value. And communicating the need. What I often suggest to our nonprofit clients is make sure that pro bono is a part of the conversation from the very beginning, in the same way that you talk about financial resources and how you're going to get the funding to get initiatives done. Have pro bono become a habit with the conversations you have with board members and staff. And you're not going to have a good fit every time. You probably most times won't, but it'll open up the opportunity to talk about it and to think about it and to bring resources to the table that otherwise would just be left out of the conversation. And then in terms of the actual access and taking those first steps, most skills-based volunteers that you'll engage are already in your network. They're your board members, your staff, and board professional acquaintances. They're your traditional volunteers who have skills that you haven't even talked to them about. And the key to unlocking those networks are to just look at these individuals beyond the roles that they're playing in their day jobs, beyond the ways that they're currently engaging with you. Define what you need and shop it around. And it's amazing how that can really bring new resources and people to the table. And then very tactically, there are intermediaries like Common Impact who can connect you to corporate pro bono. And then there are the more match.coms of skills-based volunteering like Taproot Plus and Catchafire.com, where if you're looking to engage individuals, you can go online, post your project, and get matched to an individual.
Excellent. This is really helpful information and some just excellent framing questions overall. Let's dive into the details a bit more about what these projects can look like. So what types of projects can skills-based corporate volunteers assist with? And could you provide some examples to bring this to life for our audience?
Sure. You can really engage skills-based volunteers on nearly anything from a capacity building perspective. So I mentioned a couple before: strategic and business planning, technology, marketing, data analysis, operations, HR, you name it. There are some dimensions, some initiatives, such as fundraising strategy and board engagement, that require a bit more sector translation than others. And those are the types of projects where you might want to think about, first, is pro bono the right approach? And should I use an intermediary? If it is, because there is more, there's more in the details there between the way that the corporate sector does work and the way that the nonprofit sector does work. But they also often bring a fresh perspective. So the headline is "The world is your oyster" on this. And the models that you see in front of you are the 6 key models of skills-based volunteering. So this is the how of our work. Training is good for if you have a functional topic that you need to bone up on as an organization. Companies will offer trainings to nonprofit organizations from anything from the changes in financial regulations to legal approaches, technology 101s, functional areas that don't require a ton of customization but are really important skills for your company, for your organization to know. Day of service and project consulting are our 2 most popular models and really popular among companies. The day of service is a day of skilled service, typically teams of corporate employees coming together to support a nonprofit on a high-level challenge and really frame out solutions. So an example of this would be a branding and marketing assessment where a team would look at all of the touch points that your organization is using to communicate to an external audience, perhaps a very specific external audience that you're trying to engage more deeply, and give you an assessment on where to start in terms of your focus and investment, what's working well, what's not, really a guiding light towards deeper engagement. Project consulting is, for Common Impact's model, 6 weeks to 6 months, but can really range across any time period where a team of associates, employees are working on a defined challenge. So an example of this would be a strategic or a business plan. We have one organization right now who is looking to expand into a new market, and they're trying to figure out what are the financial and operational and marketing and HR and talent implications on expanding into that market, and should we do it? How do we get to a go, no-go decision? So a team of Fidelity volunteers is helping that organization navigate that in a pretty in-depth way, a couple hours per week for the course of 6 months. Coaching is one-on-one. So not team-based necessarily, but when you have you're an executive director or program director who's tackling something a bit ambiguous like a cultural change or a leadership change, helping guide those nonprofit executives through those engagements and essentially having someone on the other end of the line to say, hey, am I crazy? Or what should I be thinking about here? A much more one-on-one personal relationship. Sabbatical is our slowest growing service line and model in general in skills-based. And this is not just Common Impact because it's an on-site loaned executive where a corporate employee comes to your organization for a period anywhere between 6 weeks and a year, sometimes it's longer, to help your organization through a time-bound but strategic challenge. Big investment for companies, big investment for the nonprofits. So when the engagement and the professional is right, it can be incredibly impactful, but it's, in terms of the opportunities that are out there, probably the smallest piece of the pie in the 6 models that you see in front of you. And then board service, we all know, and I know that Dan will be talking a bit more about this in depth, but what we often see is board service and these other skills-based models feeding each other, where board members will support skills-based volunteers coming to the table, skills-based volunteers that have engaged with you in day of service, coaching, project consulting will become really strong board candidates for your organization, and vice versa.
Those are great examples. I have just one last question for you, Danielle, regarding skills-based volunteers. How can mentoring programs make these engagements valuable and appealing to companies so they'll be invested for the long term and not just episodically, not just one-off activities?
What I always say is, as you're approaching corporate skills-based volunteering, it's so critical to put yourself in the shoes of the company that you're working with or want to work with and really pitch them. Think about how a pro bono skills-based volunteer partnership will help that company achieve their goals, whether it's engaging their employees or talent development for their employees, how it'll pay dividends for their brand in the community, how it'll help them accelerate progress on their philanthropic goals, whatever it is that will help them accelerate their own goals in partnership, something that you should really articulate for yourself, but also to them as you're pitching your project. You know, knowing what a company cares about and making sure that you're lifting up the elements of the project that are tied to those goals. That is not to say, and I want to be specific about this, it's not to say that you should craft the project based on what those goals are. It's finding the natural elements that are already there so that you can tie it and make those connections for your corporate partner. And then if you move to the next slide, another important dimension of this and something that really crafting that pitch helps set the tone for is that you want to create a mindset, a tone for your partnership that is as balanced as possible. And there is always or often going to be a power dynamic because the company and the business is providing the service, and often if you're leveraging your current corporate partnerships, they've provided funding in the past. And so there's a traditional corporate nonprofit power dynamic that I think we all know about. But really being able to articulate how this achieves not only your goals, but a company's goals will help mitigate that. And you'll want to continue to knit that into the partnership as you progress. So setting the tone and that pitch is an important foundational piece, but continuing to some of the items that you see here, being confident in your expertise. Don't fall into stereotypes about bedraggled nonprofits and companies coming in on a white horse. It's not true and really damaging to a corporate nonprofit relationship, period. saying no and providing real-time feedback is a really big one. Don't try to protect your skills-based volunteers and your corporate partnerships by sugarcoating your reflections on the results of the initiative or project that these individuals are working on. It diminishes both your investment and theirs, and they'll likely be able to tell either way, whether this is a deliverable, a product that you can really integrate into the operations of your organization. And then finally, don't be afraid to pull back the curtain and share your challenges. Engaging these companies and their employees as true partners and co-creators will open up possibilities for really long-term and continued engagement, which, to get back to where we started, that's one of the powers of skills-based volunteering, is that it's creating this ongoing resource for your organization.
These are great tips. Thank you so much for this wonderful information, Danielle. We will hear from Danielle again when we get to our Q&A toward the end, but first let's turn to another excellent way of engaging corporate partners to strengthen our infrastructure, and that's engaging corporations on boards and committees. Danielle, I have a couple of questions for you to get this started. What trends have you been seeing in corporate partnerships? And what observations can you share with us about nonprofit board engagement?
Great, thanks, Audrey. So, and great to be with everybody. And Danielle, totally excited to follow you and build upon all of the great advice that you shared around skill-based volunteerism as well. I mean, in terms of the work that I've been doing with companies across the country, there's 5 core trends that stand out that I think are important just to flag. And it really builds off of what Danielle was sharing about making the pitch for corporate partnerships. So these are things that you might want to consider in the overall proposals and pitching that you're doing. The first is most corporate partnerships today are far beyond just checkbook philanthropy and writing sponsorship checks. They're very much focused about ways that they can engage their employees. We've heard some great examples of how they can do that in pro bono and skill-based volunteerism. There's a lot of emphasis in companies today as well on proactively getting new hires through their onboarding process also engaged in their community commitments. They're really showcasing how the culture at that company is committed to strengthening the community locally by getting the people that are just joining the organization for the first time actively engaged and through those service initiatives. And then also through employee choice. We're seeing a lot of companies engaging employees and making selections of which organizations or which programs out in the community that they are participating in or supporting. So again, thinking about employee engagement in that first bucket would be super helpful as you're reaching out to companies and approaching them to be partners for your mentoring programs. The second is a solid focus on impact. And this is really, if you think about it in concentric circles, it's impact not just on the community, but the impact on the business. And Danielle's great advice in the last couple of slides was really focused on taking some time to walk a mile in the shoes of that business, understand what their specific priorities are by asking great questions in some of your early on partnership meetings. Will get you more insight into what they are looking for, what are some of the challenges that they're currently trying to tackle, and then naturally be able to link back to the work that you're doing in your mentoring program and how you could find some really solid synergy between your two organizations. You see this also playing out a lot across the country with collective impact initiatives, impact investing, or collaborative funding partnerships with multiple businesses or foundations coming together to invest in communities or in programs. The third trend that we're seeing is the focus on expansion. So a lot of companies have been focusing in on developing individual partnerships or individual programs. Maybe it's a mentoring program with a school in a priority market. And over time, they're really thinking about how they scale those initiatives to multiple markets across the country or to impact more students by connecting and working with more schools in a particular community. The key here in terms of building out that scalable version of your partnership is to keep it super simple and always focus on how you can continually scale, being mindful of your overall program design and the quality of the mentoring program that you're trying to advance for the youth that will be engaged in the initiative. Fourth trend is all about storytelling. We see some great examples out there. Citi has a whole video series of storytelling called Pathways to Progress. Starbucks for a while was running an initiative called Up Standards. So there's lots of examples of how companies are trying to take the investments and their engagement in the community and translate that to not just talking about statistics, but really bringing the stories of their work to life. And I think as mentoring programs, we have a real opportunity there to showcase the impact of an employee mentor connecting with a young person or a group of young people in the community, what the real impact is academically, on their career planning or their path to college. And the fifth trend is all around advocacy. And I think this is fairly new in the last year or two, seeing a lot of companies really step out front and make a very clear statement as a corporation around their particular stance on a social issue. So this really moves us beyond just cause marketing to really cause campaigning or cause advocacy work. And so again, if we can think of mentoring as the umbrella, that can really be a strategy to address a lot of different social issues, whether it's academic achievement, college and career persistence. We can really think differently about the role that a company can play as an advocate in a very public way, leveraging all of their various communications channels. The next couple of slides I wanted to share in terms of observations, particularly as it relates to nonprofit board engagement and bringing companies into those boards or committees. So I'm just going to move through these pretty quickly, but the first idea is this concept of balanced learning. And it's a really important point for us to think about that boards that engage in continual learning are often more effective. And that learning can really transform itself into multiple ways. One is the staff teaching the board about what they see on the front lines of the work day to day. It can translate to the board sharing with the staff the expertise that if they're in a corporate role, say in marketing, and they can bring some of the latest trends that they're learning about or applying in their corporate roles to what the nonprofit sector can apply to raise the awareness of a social issue or the call for more mentors in terms of mentor recruitment strategies. There's, again, a great balanced learning there that can happen from the board directing itself to the staff. Board to board is a piece that I often see missing on boards, and that is allowing the board members to not only network, but in a very intentional way, share their expertise and really build the skills of others on the board so that board members are seeing the value that they're getting both professionally and from the opportunity to support your mentoring program and strengthen their community where they live. And then last is what I call staff and board. And this is the concept of really bringing the staff and the board together, not creating these separate islands where staff sits over here and the board sits over here and they very rarely, outside of an executive director, interact. It's really about connecting the two and forming a learning agenda where they're discovering and learning together. And so I always encourage boards to set an annual learning agenda and really go after that by, again, leveraging the expertise that's in-house on the staff and the board, and then also introducing yourself to new individuals in the community. On the next slide, I think it's always super important to call out this observation on nonprofit boards, which is oftentimes board members come to the table, particularly from corporations, and they're not quite sure what their role is. And outside of an onboarding discussion, perhaps, there isn't a huge re-emphasis of board roles and responsibilities. And so making sure it's clear to corporate board members supporting your mentoring programs that their three primary roles are really to be focus on the financials of the organization, so their fiduciary responsibility, focus on the strategy of your mentoring organization, and focus on the executive leadership, the executive director or CEO. When they start to move or blur the lines, moving from strategy to the day-to-day tactics, that's when you often see some of the challenges start to surface. Again, people are super well-intentioned and got a lot of energy and passion around a particular topic. But when we think about engaging corporations on boards, it's really important to ensure their focus remains in the strategic planning and implementation or managing the performance of the organization versus the day-to-day tactics or being in the weeds of how the organization, how the staff in particular are operating day-to-day. The next observation is one that I always felt like I was falling victim to when I was a former executive director of a few nonprofits, and that was what I call the ED self-fulfilling prophecy. We find ourselves getting into this space where we say the board doesn't want to be engaged, or they'll never do X, Y, or Z, fill in the blank, read our reports, show up, be engaged in the way that we want them to be engaged. And in the mentoring field, we talk a lot about fixed versus growth mindset. And it's really important as senior leaders and a staff of mentoring programs to keep ourselves in the focus of growth mindset, meaning that if it's not working currently, we can learn from that experience, do something different, and reshape the current situation, right? Instead of saying something is the way it is, it's not going to change. What that lends itself to is we tend to manage people more as transactions than as relationships. In that, I mean, if you feel like the board is never going to be engaged in a meaningful way, then what we end up doing is showing up at our board meetings and reaching out to corporate partnerships and asking them to be very tactical. In other words, I need you to raise this much money by this date for our next event, or bring in this number of sponsorships for our upcoming annual gala, or I need you to give or get this particular policy by this deadline, instead of really building a relationship and understanding what tasks, what engagement opportunities will bring that individual to life that really will make them lean in to the way that they support your organization and provide contributions that go far beyond what you could even imagine at the get-go, because they become so engaged. The key to that is focusing on feedback and accountability. So constantly giving and getting feedback and incorporating that feedback into your corporate partnerships and the relationships that you have with corporate representatives serving on your boards or serving on your committees as well. The next observation is tied to the first, which is really what you put in is what you get out. I'm always so amazed when I work with boards. You know, we expect someone who's maybe a corporate IT expert to come onto a nonprofit board and know how to be an effective brand ambassador for our mentoring program, or to know how to effectively network at events in the community to raise the profile of our mentoring initiatives, or even know how to do the basic board governance in a nonprofit sector. And so it's super important for us in this space to engage our corporate board members and committee members in the training and development that's necessary to build their skills and their confidence really in these key areas that will help move the needle for our organizations, help drive us to a higher level of success. And then the last observation that in terms of board engagement and particularly working with corporations, we flipped the slide, is really around focus. And you know, as a board member myself, and as well as a former ED, I can tell you that one of the biggest challenges with boards is often their eagerness lends itself to moving in lots of different directions and being interested in a lot of different things. And if we can pull the focus of the board and the way that we're working with corporations to really prioritize and focus in on those priorities, we will get much further, much faster. The ways that I would recommend doing that, one is to create a simple placemat. Sounds super cheesy. I did this all the time as an executive director. Literally take an 8.5 by 11 sheet of paper, and could be a PowerPoint slide, very bold, big font, what your strategic priorities are, and that becomes the placemat for every committee meeting, every board meeting, every time you're interacting with corporate partnerships, making sure that front and center in all of those discussions of the strategic priorities of the organization will help you keep the focus that you need in order to get your strategic priorities fulfilled. The next is making sure that they're always listed at the top of every board agenda and all of the board meeting minutes and any documents really that you send out to board of directors or committees. And then lastly is always making sure that the committees and the working groups that you have identified the need for have very clear focus on what are their goals, what are their tactics, and how they will ultimately be held accountable. The last thing I would just say in this space is to effectively engage corporate partners and corporate members on your boards, be mindful of provocative questions and the role that they play in engaging that board. And what I mean by that is instead of just reciting all the great things that you've done since the last board meeting, focus on provocative questions such as what could put us out of business over the next few quarters? What if our executive director left? What if we lost a half of our budget tomorrow? What would we prioritize? What would we focus on? What are our top 1 to 2 most important priorities that we need to make sure we get accomplished in the next quarter or in the next month or in the next year? Asking those types of provocative questions and allowing the board to engage in that type of dialogue really, again, helps you to leverage their expertise and their strengths in a really thoughtful way.
Really insightful, Dan. Thank you so much for sharing those observations. Before we launch into the next section, I just want to remind our audience that we will be queuing up questions toward the end of this webinar, so please send in your questions that you have for Danielle and Dan. So now let's talk about strategies and tools. Can you share your thoughts on how mentoring programs should determine what companies to approach for this type of support?
Absolutely. Great question. So I think first and foremost, it's about getting the right people on the bus from the corporate partnerships that you're working with. And the first step in order to do that is to really begin with the end in mind. So as a mentoring program or organization, it's really to hit pause on all of the day-to-day work that you're doing and to really ask yourself, what are our strategic priorities? And therefore, what are the skills, experiences, or networks that we need to achieve those goals? Then reflect on who you already have on the bus and how their skills, experience, and networks overlaps with what you just mapped out as your needs. And where there are gaps, that becomes your roadmap. That becomes your set of priorities in terms of filling the empty seats within your board or within your committees or working groups. Once you've got that clarity around what you're looking for, right, the vision ultimately, of the perfect bus. The second step is to find what you need in a really proactive way. I tell executive directors and governance committees all the time to be always in recruitment mode. So always be looking in your community, looking in your businesses, at networking events for individuals that have both the passion and the sense of purpose, coupled with the strengths, the expertise, the experience, et cetera, that you need to fill those empty seats. So what this means is leverage first your existing network, be super clear with your current board, with your current staff, your donors, what you're looking for, what you need in terms of the right people on the bus. And then second, as all great marketers will say, go where your target audience is. So don't just go to the nonprofit networking events. Go to the networking events that align to the expertise or the networks that you're trying to bring into your organization. Go to the HR functions or to the university alumni gatherings. Go to community events that are different from your day-to-day work so that you can introduce yourself to a different set of expertise, a different set of experiences to really accelerate your success as an organization. Step 3 is to really interview each of those people that you start to cultivate and try to bring into or onto your bus. And the key here is to clearly articulate what your expectations are. So aligning with what Danielle was saying when you're thinking about engaging skill-based volunteers, make sure you're clear about the scope and what you're looking for them to be able to fulfill. And also ask them what their expectations of you as an organization are for their engagement. So what you want to make sure you create from the very beginning is a really clear natural fit where both of you and the individual you're targeting are adding value to the work that you're trying or to the mission that you're trying to advance. The fourth step in the process is to really confirm and complete the onboarding. And this goes far beyond just giving them the board member handbook. This is really about setting everybody up for success and driving that engagement from day one. So matching those new board members with somebody who's already on the board, as well as somebody on the staff to serve as mentors to them, to get acclimated to the organization, and to really, again, be thinking creatively about how their expertise, their network can be fully leveraged. There should be clarity about the role that they're filling, the gap that they're filling within your set of strategic priorities. The next tool is just and the next slide rather is just a tool to put in your toolbox around getting the right people on the bus. And I use this again with boards and corporate partnerships to remind us that we're not looking necessarily for the people that are going to function at the surface level of our mentoring programs. In other words, we're not looking for people who are going to come to us and just ask us about the latest program, the latest event. We're looking for people that really dig below the surface and help us to understand the patterns that might be playing out within our work or within the broader mentoring field. Once we understand some of those patterns, we start to understand some of the underlying structures that contribute to those patterns. And therefore, we can start to understand what are some of those assumptions or the mental models, some of the systems that are keeping us away from achieving our full potential or achieving our mission. You want people who can dig below the surface, because if you're day-to-day in the work, you may not always see or connect the dots to understand the patterns or trends or the underlying structures. So somebody who's sort of that third-party perspective from an objective point of view can help surface those types of conversations at a board meeting or a committee meeting. And again, it adds tremendous value to helping you advance your mission.
Those steps and questions are so helpful. I think programs will really be able to use these strategies when determining how to start looking for people who will be the right fit for their organization. We all know that it can be really difficult to get corporations interested in helping our organizations in deep and meaningful ways, though. So Dan, how can mentoring programs make these engagements valuable and appealing to companies so they'll be invested for long-term and not just episodically?
Absolutely. So first and foremost, again, I'll keep reiterating the statement, focus on relationship building, not transactions. All of us, again, I'm making the assumption, we're all here because we are passionate about mentoring and we're trying to close the mentoring gap and elevate the mentoring field. Our work day to day is all about making relationships happen, right? It's not about those transactional moments. It's about the relationship long term. And so I want to be mindful of time, so I'll give you a quick snapshot of this great book. It's called Shine from Dr. Hallowell. And basically the book plays out into these 5 core recommendations on how to get your organization to a point where it can truly shine. And so when you think about corporate partnerships, you think about engaging corporate individuals on your boards and in your committees. Again, the first is to not just select the right people, but to put them into positions, give them the responsibilities that really light them up, that energize them, that make them want to lean into the work, that give them a strong sense of accountability and purpose for why they're on your board or why they're a part of a working group that you have or a partner with you in your mentoring program. Connect them in a really intentional way to other board members and staff. And you can do this by creating these interpersonal bonds. So I was on the board for City Year in DC. Every board meeting started by sharing what we called ripples and joys. So things that we as individuals, professionally or personally, wanted to celebrate that has happened to us since the last board meeting. And I'll tell you what, those sharing moments, it took about 15 minutes of the board meeting. It created so many great relationships and bonds among the team that it really made us feel like we were part of one single effort to move the mission forward. That translated into how we played together, how we really brought our imaginations and our creativity to the surface. A key thing to think about here is if you've got the right talent on your team, the next 2 pieces of the equation that you need to put in place are, first, create the playful environment. So create that space that play music as people are coming into your board meeting and they'll start to, give you that look when they walk in the room, but that music will energize and create a tone for how they engage in the conversation during the meeting. Put the toys on the table and the kinetic learners will engage in a different way than what they've had in the past. So the environment is super important. And then third is the process. So creating some structure around how they put their imaginations to work, which plays into the next point around grappling and growing. If we can prioritize 1 or 2 key challenges, key obstacles that we're currently facing in advancing our priorities, we can engage board members in digging deep into those challenges. Rather than a broad conversation, we can get super focused and really put ourselves in a place of conflict where we are continually learning from the expertise and the network and the experience of those that are in the room. That's what will drive the relationship. It'll drive corporate partnerships to think differently about how they unlock other resources, other assets that they might have to move your organization, your mission forward. And then lastly, when you see that happening, call it out, right? Use the right rewards to stimulate that sense of loyalty and commitment. People tend to naturally be competitive. So if they hear a fellow board member or working group member from a company being recognized for their contribution, they will ask themselves internally, how can I get that level of recognition? How can I add the value that that individual is adding? And really, again, through recognition, through these types of rewards, we can drive the type of behavior that we want from our corporate partnerships and our relationships. Another tool or resource to put in your toolbox on the next slide is a book called The Inspiration Factor by Terry Barber. And my favorite 3 words from this book, you get nothing else from it, is notice, name, and nurture. And if we're engaging our corporate partners and our corporate representatives on our boards and our committees in a meaningful way, we are noticing their meaningful contributions, how they're adding value. We are purposefully, intentionally naming it and saying, hey, Audrey, I noticed that you have been showing up not only on time to every board meeting, but jumping right in to the agenda and asking how you can add value. Or I see you building relationships and strengthening bonds with other members on the board, which again makes us feel like we're all part of a stronger team. And I just want to encourage you to keep doing that because I see the difference that it's making. By noticing, naming, and nurturing in the same way we would encourage mentors to do this with young people, we want to do it with our corporate partners and the board members from the companies serving on our team. The last couple, oh, go ahead, Audrey.
No, I was just going to say, do you want to cover these last 2 slides for us, and then we'll move on to the round table?
Perfect. Sounds good. So the last couple of pieces are just, again, about when we manage relationships, when we think about corporate partners or corporate board members, it's really about focusing ourselves on accountability, both our own accountability of how we're engaging them in a meaningful way and their accountability, making sure that they're holding up their end of the bargain in terms of what they have committed to as being a part of the team. Some creative ways that you can do that is establishing an annual performance plan for each board member. I did this with all the boards that I've been a part of before, where you basically create 2 to 3 goals that you're asking that board member to commit to in the beginning of the year. You track their performance based on those goals that they have co-created with you, and you share an update either mid-year or quarterly with them about where they are tracking towards those goals. You give them feedback, and you get feedback from them about what's working, what's not working, potentially what's holding them up from achieving those goals, and how can you problem solve together to ultimately to get to the finish line. And then you have this shared collective accountability report back to the board that says, not one-on-one, not that Dan didn't do 1 out of his 3 goals, but collectively as a board, we're at about 75% of the way towards our individual board goals in order to achieve everything we set out as a board to achieve this year. That level of accountability and reporting reminds us that we have a part to play in the overall team's performance and the overall advancement of the mission. And so it also sets you up to celebrate the success and really call out, again, the effective ways that corporate partners or corporate board members are engaging along the way. A tool for your toolbox is just the 4 levers of change that's outlined here. It's just a reminder for us to think about if we are not happy with the way that our corporate partnerships or corporate engagement is working, ask ourselves, how are we inspiring and leading these partners? How are we engaging them in a meaningful way, not necessarily that's aligned 100% with the way we want to be engaged, but with the way they want to be engaged? How are we measuring that engagement so that we know that it's aligned to our strategic priorities and the goals that they have for their board service? And then 4th, how are we communicating? How are we making sure that people are informed along the way and making progress towards those priorities? And the last tool that I would share with you, or 2 more really, focus on accountability slide here is about what's called the skill will matrix. I love this tool when we think about engaging corporate partners or corporate board members because it challenges us to think about, do they have the will to do what we need done, to fill those seats on the bus and to fill the gaps that we have with the skills and expertise? And do they have the skill to be effective in executing whatever those goals are? And what this guide enables us to do is redirect or personalize the way that we are working with that individual or with that partner. So for example, if they've got high will but low skill, we know that that's something that maybe we have them shadow an effective board member, or we talk to them about one of our most effective corporate partnerships so they can understand and start to build the skill for how to drive a more effective overall partnership. Another example real quick is if you have high skill, so somebody who's really an expert in something, and low will, we energize them by equipping them with the stories that they're going to remember and retell, as well as the data to drive more effective decision making within our organizations. Audrey, I'll toss it back to you.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Dan, for all of that information. It's just great to know that there are so many resources available to help us to engage corporate employees on boards and committees. I'd love to spend the rest of our time talking with both of you, actually. So I've prepared a few questions, but I actually really want to make sure that we get to the audience questions. So I'm going to narrow it down and just choose one or two of these next questions. So Danielle and Dan, let's look at number 3. What are some alerts that it's time to celebrate wins in this partnership, or conversely, alerts that there could be challenges ahead? And this can be for either of you, whoever wants to kick this off.
This is Danielle. I'll give a quick headline from our perspective, and I think some of the frameworks that Dan shared would be really useful to apply to this question. I would say when you're thinking about a corporate partnership, when you see a change in the scope of the work or the way they're engaging with you as an organization that is shifting to align more with their goals than with yours, that's a flag for having a conversation, because as much as you want to pitch to companies and align with their goals, you don't want to change essentially what you're getting and what you need based on that. So I would say that is one flag for challenge. And celebrating wins, I say don't want to beat on this too much, because I think Dan gave a lot of great examples of that relationship versus transaction and ways to have signs for that. And so we'll leave it at that.
And I would just add, be mindful of the space. So when you're meeting with corporate partners or you're engaging corporate members on your board or in working committees, quiet rooms are not good, right? It's a sign that people are not engaged and don't have that sense of relationship with one another yet. And the more that you can start to shift that, your measure of success is how energized is that room when you walk into it with those partners. And also sort of pre-meeting, post-meeting. Are people flying in and flying out, or are they really engaged and sticking around to engage further in the conversation or further in the relationship building process?
Those are great alerts. Thank you both for sharing that. So I'm going to ask my final question, which is, what are typical challenges that can arise in these types of partnerships specifically?
So in skills-based partnerships, one of the common challenges when you're working with corporate professionals is that work gets in the way and they have to prioritize their day-to-day job over the work that they're doing for you. And again, I think this gets back to the development of relationships versus a transactional relationship. If you are able to inspire and energize your skilled volunteers from the get-go, then they're going to have more of a connection to you. And you might have to extend the project timeline, or you might have to shift deliverables slightly so that they can engage, but they will continue to be connected to you and to be a resource to you. But that's the biggest challenge that we see with skills-based volunteering, just the pure time commitment that you need from your skilled volunteers.
And I would just add two things real quick. One is I feel like the top challenge is that a lot of times companies want to go big fast. And it's really important using this 3-word expression I drive all the time in meetings, which is awareness drives action. In other words, if we can increase the awareness of corporate partners about what it takes on the front line of our mentoring programs to build not just high quantities of mentoring relationships, but high quality mentoring relationships, we can slow them down and get them to simplify the work that we're doing in a way that can accelerate us much faster down the road. If we start too big, too fast, we often break in terms of both our partnership and in terms of the quality of what we're trying to produce. And it's not sticky. So focus on small and simple steps that over time will be able to accelerate you towards success much faster.
Excellent. Those are all the questions I have for you because I really want to turn this over to our audience questions. So Benji, what do you have for us?
Great. So one question I have from the audience is, who are the appropriate people from your nonprofit who should be making the initial pitch to recruit a skill-based volunteer? Should it be the executive director? Should it be board members themselves, or should it be development staff?
It depends. I know that's not a helpful answer, but what we recommend is having someone who has the decision-making power within whatever area the project's in. So if it's a technology project, having someone who handles or makes decisions on your technology for your organization. And also has enough expertise or experience in that functional area, even if it's the most at your organization, it's all relative, in order to be conversant in conversations with companies around what you really need and being able to articulate your requirements. The other dimension of this is it matters who you're talking to at the company. So if this is a brand new partnership and you're talking to someone fairly senior at the company who has a formal program that they're looking to involve you in, then having your executive director or pretty senior level leadership is appropriate there. Some skills-based volunteer programs are growing organically within companies and are the passion projects of what we call entrepreneurs, corporate employees who want to build a skills-based program, in which case then you want to connect them to the person at your organization who they either have an existing relationship with or has the most knowledge of that relationship.
Thank you, Danielle. Benji, do you have another question for us?
I do. Danielle, I know you covered this a little bit during the first section when you were talking about different models of skill-based volunteer projects, but one question we had was, are there certain types of skill-based volunteers, certain fields there where you can have more impact than others? And are there certain types of projects that lend themselves better to skill-based volunteers than others?
Sure. So technology and marketing and operations tend to be the functional categories that translate most clearly and need less sector translation. Strategy and business planning is in the middle, where you need to understand the nonprofit sector landscape as a corporate professional in order to make real tangible recommendations and support leadership, nonprofit leadership in planning. And then fundraising, board engagement, accounting, and some financial planning. There are basic infrastructural differences between the nonprofit sector and the corporate sector, not insurmountable at all. And we have a ton of projects in those categories, but especially as you're starting out, or if those projects are particularly complex, that last set that I mentioned, then it's worth making sure that pro bono and skills-based is the right match for you for that particular project at that time.
I think we have time for just one more question, Benji. Do you have anything else for us?
Sure. Dan, we had somebody ask if you provide some specific examples of opportunities for balanced learning for board to board.
Yeah, absolutely. So I used to run our volunteer center in Pittsburgh, Pittsburgh Cares, and one of the things that we would do with our board of directors is we would essentially host a Saturday morning retreat. And first part of that retreat was always about board-to-board education. So we would do a round robin. We would identify maybe 3 board members who would want to volunteer, who were in different industries or had different expertise. And we spent about 15 to 20 minutes sort of in a speed learning session where other board members would sit with them and they would sort of share some of the latest trends that they're seeing in their area of work. So for example, somebody who was in the marketing space who ran a local PR agency, she would share some of the latest trends that she was seeing with her clients around cause marketing campaigns or external communications tactics. And what it enabled us to do as a board is, board members expanded their expertise and their professional learning, while at the same time, starting with that activity during our Saturday retreat enabled them to translate their learning into action as we went through developing the game plans for how we were going to meet our strategic priorities.
Thank you so much, Benji, for queuing up those great questions for our panelists. And thank you so much, Danielle and Dan, for sharing your expertise and all of your incredibly insightful and helpful information with us today. I think our organizations watching will have a lot of practical information that they can utilize immediately, which is always what we're looking for. So to wrap up this webinar, I just want to share some information about resources available to your organizations and next steps. So if you'd like to learn more about developing impactful corporate partnerships, please check out our previous webinar, Maximizing the Potential of Corporate Partnerships, from October 2016. And while you're there, feel free to peruse the other excellent webinars from the Collaborative Mentoring webinar series to tackle all of your mentoring needs. Mentor scales impact by developing and supporting a national network of affiliates. These affiliates provide the leadership and infrastructure necessary to support the expansion of quality mentoring relationships in local communities or statewide. Mentor affiliates also serve a unique role as a clearinghouse for training, resources, public awareness, and advocacy. We encourage you to find out whether you have an affiliate in your region and connect with them to learn about local resources and training opportunities. Additionally, we encourage you to register your program with the Mentoring Connector, which is a national database of mentoring programs. This zip code searchable database allows mentors and mentees from across the country to find your program, and it's connected to LinkedIn, NBA Cares, Mentor.gov, and so many other avenues of free program promotion. Finally, check out the OJJDP National Mentoring Resource Center website for no-cost mentoring resources to help you apply evidence-based mentoring practices to your program. The OJJDP NMRC provides evidence reviews on mentoring models and mentoring for special populations, implementation resources, so everything from training manuals to mentor guides that have been reviewed by the NMRC Research Board, a blog featuring innovations and best practices for mentoring practitioners, and the opportunity to request no-cost technical assistance. As a reminder, 1 week after the webinar, all attendees will receive an email with a link to the Collaborative Mentoring Webinar Series webpage, where we will post the recording, slides, and additional resources. So it's just 1 week away. Also, don't forget, we want your feedback. At the end of today's webinar, please answer the short survey and help us to make this series even better. We utilize all of your feedback to continue to revise and help this series to grow. Be sure to visit the Collaborative Mentoring Webinar Series page on the Mentor website for an archive of all of our past webinars and information about the upcoming webinars. And finally, thanks to everyone for joining us today. We hope that you'll join us next month on April 19th for our next webinar on screening and safety. Thank you, and we hope you have an excellent day.